Good afternoon, and welcome to the 7th Annual Graduate School of Arts and Sciences Master's SynThesis competition. My name is Rachel Bernard, and I am the Director of GSAS Compass, the Office of Graduate Career Development, and I'm your host for today's event. It is my pleasure to introduce Dean Carlos J. Alonso, Morris A. and Alma Shapiro Professor in the Humanities, Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and Vice President for Graduate Education, who will offer opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is my great pleasure to open the 7th Annual Graduate School of Arts and Sciences Master's SynThesis competition. Welcome to the friends, family, peers, alumni, staff, and faculty who have come here today or who are joining us online to celebrate our master's students. The thesis is a capstone experience of many of our master's programs in the graduate school. Students take this opportunity to apply the tools, methods, and modes of inquiry they have studied in their coursework to answer an original research question. SynThesis is not only a celebration of this intellectual journey, but an awe-inspiring display of these students' ability to distill and present their work to us, an educated generalist audience, in only 3 minutes and with one single slide. This afternoon, we will hear from 12 of our talented master's students on thesis topics ranging from open source AI to a sacred decorative box from medieval Japan, from the effects of human activity on deer and raccoon populations in New York City, I want to hear about that, to one family's oral history of the 1994 Rwandan genocide. These 12 finalists were selected from a deep and impressive pool of applicants from across all departments of the graduate school. They have worked hard and long to synthesize their thesis research and prepare for today's event. We deeply appreciate the many MA program faculty and staff who support and encourage their students to pursue ambitious research. These outstanding students would not be here without your commitment. I would also like to thank our panel of faculty and alumni judges. I do not envy the difficult decisions you will have to make today. Since our inaugural event in 2016, I have looked forward to SynThesis every year because it embodies the graduate school's central aim: to provide our students with opportunities that allow them to thrive academically, professionally, and personally, both during their sojourn with us and afterward. To the 12 finalists, you exemplify the range and depth of graduate student research at Columbia, as well as the university's mission not just to advance knowledge and learning at the highest level, but to convey the products of your effort to the wider community. We admire your commitment to sharing your knowledge and passion for your work and are very proud of what you have accomplished. Good luck with your presentations. You got this.
Thank you, Dean Alonso. I would now like to welcome and introduce our faculty and alumni judges. Dhananjay Jagannathan, Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Director of Graduate Studies for the Classical Studies program. Reena Jana, Head of Content and Partnership Enablement, Responsible Innovation at Google, and graduate of the South Asian Studies Master's program. Jake Moreno-Copland, CEO of America Needs You and graduate of the Human Rights Studies MA program. Amy Starczewski, director of the Oral History MA program. Chiara Superti, lecturer in the discipline of political science and director of the Political Science MA program. Thank you all so much for serving on the judging panel. Okay, so today's competition will begin shortly with presentations from the 12 finalists. Please refer to your event program for the order in which they will speak. Each finalist will present for 3 minutes using only one slide, and unlike me, no notes. I get to cheat. And they'll be evaluated both on the content of their presentations as well as their delivery. At the conclusion of the presentation, the judges' scores will be tallied and the winners will be announced. The top 3 presenters, according to our panel of judges, will be awarded prizes of $1,000, $500, and $250, respectively. And audience members, keep in mind your vote counts as well. Following the presentations, we will provide instructions to cast your vote for audience choice. And now we will begin with our first presenter. Jack West from American Studies will present There is No Constitution Now: White Supremacy, Paramilitary Violence, Liberal State Failure, and the Hamburg Massacre.
On the night of July 8th, 1876, in the small town of Hamburg, South Carolina, 6 black men were taken one by one over a small hill, and they were shot. The perpetrators of the violence that night were members of a white supremacist paramilitary organization known as the South Carolina Red Shirts. In justifying their attacks this night, one of the Red Shirts told a black resident of Hamburg, quote, "There's no constitution now. It's been 100 years since the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution is played out." My intention in studying this instance of racist violence is not to prove that American history is bloody. Rather, my research focuses on the fact that Hamburg was only the first in a series of similar attacks, massacres, assassinations that swept across South Carolina in 1876. I focus on the fact that the perpetrators of this violence were well organized, they were uniformed, and they were successful. In early 1877, the Red Shirts successfully overthrew the democratically elected government of South Carolina and effectively halted the US project of Reconstruction. My thesis uses a lens of mass politics to analyze these events. In particular, I highlight 2 structural fault lines that underlay the project of Reconstruction. The first was the politicization of a racist ideology, and the second was the repeated failure of a democratic regime to protect its citizens from anti-democratic violence. Throughout 1876, those 2 forces coalesced into a political movement which was strong enough to halt the project of liberal democracy and effectively push the federal government into retreat. We now find ourselves 250 years since the Declaration of Independence. And again, anti-democratic violence is threatening the liberal democratic project. From tiki torches in Charlottesville to Trump flags at the Capitol, those of us who have a vested interest in preserving some parts of the democratic institutions have to reckon with the fact that the same two structural fault lines which underlay Reconstruction tremble beneath our feet as well. In the weeks after Hamburg, Harper's Weekly published this image, and it includes 3 questions, which I now pose to you in our current context of routine police violence and political instability. Is this a Republican form of government? Is this protection of life, liberty, or property? And finally, is this equal protection of the laws? Thank you.
Next, we have Brooke Helmick from Human Rights Studies presenting Human Rights and the Rise of Extremist Hate Groups, Lessons for American Democracy.
How do we define the health of American democracy? As a civil rights advocate and a human rights practitioner, I understand this in part by measuring the health of a community, not just the survival of the people, but their quality of life. And I understand this through a term I've created called social wellness indicators, which captures different intervals of stability, such as high school graduation rates, food security, and voting participation, through the lens of internationally recognized human rights obligations. And these metrics are helpful to understand the stability of a democracy. This is where my research comes in. I aggregated data from civil society and federal databases to identify a potential correlation between extremism and social wellness. And what I found was incredibly interesting. I found that there was a clear correlation between high levels of social wellness and low levels of extremism. But the reverse was not always true. This is important for two reasons. First, increasing state funding for social wellness programming not only increases the quality of life for the American people, but has a clear correlation with keeping rates of extremism low. And so this means that social wellness programming is an easily achievable prevention tactic to limit extremist organizations from being able to grow and expand their base. Secondly, my research corroborates the work of others, demonstrating that once extremism has taken hold in a community, it is incredibly difficult to root out. The rhetoric and motivational language of these organizations tends to follow general patterns, but it doesn't seem to reach those most left behind by system failures, those that we logically may assume would want to push against and disrupt governmental structures. And so, the strongest tool in our prevention toolkit will be to prevent the movement of the Overton window, the normalization of extremist language, and to prevent extremist organizers from being able to gain a platform in the national conversation, because there's a clear link between extremist organizing and democratic backsliding. As my research indicates, when human rights obligations are met by the state through social wellness programming, the rates of extremism and hate organizing remain low. And so, these indicators can be used by civil society and advocates looking to find tangible ways to strengthen American democracy. History indicates that the democratic process, strong as it may appear to be, is actually incredibly fragile and can easily collapse when the circumstances are right. And therefore, participating in advocating for and electing officials who support these policies, as well as being brave enough to run yourself, is of paramount importance when seeking to build safer, more peaceful, stable democratic communities. Thank you.
Ornella Baganizi from Oral History presents Umumbano Mubantu, Love Among People.
When people ask me where am I really from, what I usually answer is my parents came from Rwanda. As for me, I was born in Canada, but I grew up distant and disconnected from the country. My thesis project flourished out of this desire to better understand my Rwandan ancestry. I conducted an oral history project with my parents to understand their lives in Rwanda. During one of the interviews I had with my father, I asked him, what was his favorite song? He answered, Umubano Mubantu, which translates to Love Among People by François Nkurunziza. This song inspired my thesis project and became the title of this work. Umubano Mubantu, Love Among People is a multimedia collection of 9 audio short stories from the oral history life interviews I conducted with my parents, which I then combined into a continuous documentary. Each of the short stories are woven together by the song. The film centers around my parents' love story, but the short stories highlight the family members they lost during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. They are pictured on this slide. Through everyday stories, I'm trying to highlight the people they were and the loving relationships they had amongst each other. You can meet my mother's mother, pictured here, in the short story, The Color Red. In it, my mother explains how red became her favorite color because her mother used to love dressing her up in red and her little sister in blue. Another goal of this research was to archive my family's story in order to create and preserve intergenerational knowledge for future generations. This thesis project exists as an experience in remembering our past lives and a way to honor our ancestors. When I was putting this thesis together, I was very intentional in how I wanted to frame the genocide. I refused to talk about the violence and the hate because that's already the dominant narrative around histories of genocide. I wanted to talk about something different. I wanted to talk about love. What would it mean to insert love in a conversation about hate? What would that look like? I want my project to generate internal dialogue as to what love among people means against the backdrop of so much hatred in the world. What is our current relationship with each other? By bringing forth a different message around genocide, one that centers love, I hope to break from the theoretical but also literal cycles of violence that these stories exist in. How do we overcome genocide if not through love? Thank you.
Melissa Feeney from Quantitative Methods in the Social Sciences will present domain generalization abilities of aspect-based sentiment analysis models using transformer encodings through transfer learning.
Hi, everyone. I'm sure by now most of you have used ChatGPT, or at the very least have heard of it. You may be amazed by its abilities to answer your questions in a very conversational manner or respond to your prompts. But have you ever wondered what makes it all possible? Enter GPT-3, the large language model, or transformer, that's making it all possible under the hood. My thesis research aimed to study these types of models, which are neural networks that can understand text by considering both its sequential nature and by recognizing relationships among words. Specifically, my research accounted for 3 different transformer models, namely BERT by Google, Roberta by Meta, and GPT-2, GPT-3's predecessor, by OpenAI, and aimed to compare the aspect-based sentiment analysis, or which I'll refer to as ABSA, abilities of each. ABSA is a field of sentiment analysis that aims to identify not only the aspects mentioned in a text, but also the sentiment expressed toward each aspect. This is very important in customer reviews, where someone might mention that one thing in a text was positive, but another thing was negative. Take, for example, a restaurant review that might state, the food was tasteless, but the service was great, which indicates positive sentiment towards service, but negative sentiment towards food. I wanted to investigate if a model that could perform ABSA in customer restaurant reviews could successfully transfer its ABSA abilities to perform ABSA in customer apparel reviews. Transfer learning is the ability of testing exactly that ability, taking a model trained for one task and applying it to a new task for which it was not originally trained to understand the transferability of its skill sets. To those practitioners in the NLP field, this can be extremely important because training these models is very expensive, both computationally and financially. In conclusion, my thesis research supports my question that my transformer model can successfully generalize from performing ABSA in customer restaurant reviews to customer apparel reviews. Although it's presumed that reviews from both of these domains are probably quite different in respect to the words and expressions used, my research further affirms the impressive ability of transformer models to truly understand text. Thank you.
Belen Ipola from Economics presents the effect of reducing grade retention on student performance and dropout in Brazil.
Did you know that 1/3 of students in Brazil repeat a grade at some point? Grade retention or repetition is an education policy that is applied when a student does not meet the minimum requirements in order to be promoted to the next grade and is held back. In Brazil, and more broadly in Latin America, this is common practice, and many students experience grade retention each year. This led me to wonder whether we're sure this policy is working the way it should. Is it really improving the student outcomes we care about, like achievement and high school completion, or is it doing more harm than good? The little evidence we have on this doesn't show a consensus. So with my thesis, I contribute to building this empirical evidence on the effects of grade retention policies. However, this is not an easy task, because correlation does not imply causation. This means that if we take the test scores of students who have repeated a grade and compare them to the test scores of students who haven't repeated a grade, we're mixing up the effects of the policy itself, which is what we're trying to estimate, with other characteristics like motivation or ability, which affect both test scores and the likelihood of repeating a grade. So how can we disentangle this? Fortunately, new econometric methods have been developed that allow us to isolate a policy's causal effects. I use one of these methods called staggered difference in differences in the context of a policy that decreased retention rates in Distrito Federal, a state in Brazil. The policy was progressively introduced across schools in Distrito Federal between 2013 and 2018. And the fact that schools adopted the policy at different moments in time within this period is key for my model to estimate these causal effects. I gathered data from the school census, which covers over 1,200 schools in Distrito Federal, and I combine it with test score data from standardized tests taken by 5th graders every 2 years. My results show that this policy, decreasing retention rates, increased enrollment by 10% on average. It had no effect on math test scores, and it decreased Portuguese test scores. So now that we know this, we can start thinking about how to improve this policy. And we could think about complementing it with targeted educational support, such as tutoring, for those students who are behind in Portuguese. And that way we could keep those huge positive effects from enrollment. Therefore, with my thesis, I evaluated a policy that decreased retention rates in Brazil. However, the effort must not stop here. With so many students going through grade retention each year and worldwide, it's crucial that we keep producing empirical evidence to improve the design of these policies. Thank you.
Xiaoku Yang from East Asian Languages and Cultures presents Gift Box for the Goddess, a Buddhist scripture container from 12th century Japan.
What is the first thing comes up to your mind when you hear the word samurai? Martial arts, military skills, and perhaps your favorite character in this new fighting game. Our general conception of samurai has been largely limited to their military accomplishments. It seems that this is the only source of their prestige. However, ever since the medieval period, warriors have been assimilating themselves into the aristocrats to seek their power. Religion, especially Buddhism, has been an important element in this process. My thesis studies this understudied Heikei no-kyo sutra box as an early example of warriors' religious offering as political strategies. It is a copper container to contain a copy of the Lotus Sutra, which was regarded as the most treasured Buddhist scripture at that time. The family of Heikei dedicated to their guardian deity in 1164, after the first major promotion of their leader. As you can see, the goddess was understood as a compassionate maritime trade protector in the Lotus Sutra, and she was understood as the most powerful figure in the same scripture. Heikei was actively engaged in maritime trade with China at this period, and using the same material of the Chinese copper coins, which was largely imported into Japan under their influence, the Heikei tried to transform their economic power into this gift to protect over their trade in the future. Moreover, the goddess is understood as the same dragon princess appeared in the Lotus Sutra, who offered her precious jewel to the Buddha and achieved enlightenment. When this box was made, the daughter of the leader was at the same age of the dragon princess, and scholars have suggested that this parallel may result in this repeating jewel offering motif happening in this box. that the Heike also wants their daughter to marry into the imperial house and lead the ascendant of their family. In conclusion, this box is not only a showcase of their economic and political power, but also to enhance their bond to the local deity. After this box was dedicated, the leader was promoted to the highest rank that was limited to other aristocrats, and the daughter married into the imperial house and became a mother of future emperor. We now see that the Heike has redefined themselves into new aristocrats with the help of goddess, who must have been placed by this gift box. Thank you very much.
Miles Davis from Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation Biology presents the NYC Wildlife Transect, the effect of urban intensity and human activity on wildlife distributions around NYC green spaces.
During lockdowns, do you remember how the internet was flooded with images of deer and other wildlife roaming freely in cities around the world? Everywhere we saw headlines that animals were taking back the city, and people loved it. In a time where human expansion is seen as a leading threat to global conservation, the wildlife response to this sudden pause in human activity raises some interesting questions, like what animals are actually present in our cities, and how does urban development and human activity affect how wildlife use our cities? In collaboration with several organizations, I sought to answer this question with my thesis, the New York City Wildlife Transect. I established a network of wildlife trail cameras in over 34 green spaces across New York City, like parks, cemeteries, and golf courses. In the screen above, you can see that this network spans a 50K line across Brooklyn, Queens, and Nassau County, an urban to rural gradient. These motion-triggered photo cameras operate 24 hours and can tell us which spaces elusive mammals like raccoons and deer are present in. With this data, I investigated how changes in housing density influence species distribution. I also used contact tracing phone location data to explore the effects of human activity as well. This is the first camera monitoring transect for the city, and I modeled distributions of raccoon, deer, possum, skunks, coyote, and I also found the first statistical evidence that higher levels of human activity in New York green spaces may deter raccoon and possum presence. And finally, I brought New York into the Urban Wildlife Information Network, a collaborative research network of similar camera projects in over 40 North American cities. So how does all of this actually help? In recent years, we've seen the return of coyotes and skunks and increases in deer and raccoon presence in the city. Having grown up in Brooklyn, I understand how these changes can be surprising for New Yorkers. To spread awareness, all the photos are made available on a database, which is shared on the cameras, and you can see it on the bottom of the screen. I've had students of all ages get involved, for example, by setting cameras or identifying photos like the ones you see above on the database. The distribution data can help the city with rabies vaccination campaigns for raccoons or to track the risk of tick-borne diseases which correlate with deer presence. New York is the largest city in North America. Results from here can serve as a model for conservation and wildlife management for growing cities across the continent. As data collection continues, we'll be able to make predictions on how wildlife might respond as parts of the city grow. Lockdowns may have ended, but that glimpse of wildlife we had isn't just a headline from the past. It's a roadmap to a brighter future that we can build.
Next is Cindy Chen from Quantitative Methods in the Social Sciences, presenting Are New York State's Cash Bail Decisions Fair? An investigation into judges and bail reform.
Did you know that New York is the only state in America where bail terms are supposed to be unbiased? In other words, judges are supposed to set bail, which is money paid for a defendant's release from jail prior to their trial, based solely on two conditions: their ability to pay bail, as well as the risk of missing court. Unlike other states, New York judges ideally don't factor any subjective opinions around defendants' perceived dangerousness, but judges have ultimately full discretion over the amounts that they set for bail-eligible crimes. So that begs the question, Do New York judges really follow through with unbiased cash bail decisions? My thesis aimed to investigate exactly that and measure racial biases through the dollar amounts of bail themselves, especially in light of New York's controversial bail reform laws in 2020 that aim to increase equity and fairness, but have faced tons of backlash for being too lenient. Using data around defendants' demographics, their criminal history, charges, as well as their estimated income, I used an uncommon approach called Bayesian statistics to measure the role that race plays. I chose this approach for two reasons. First, it's very effective at understanding how bail amounts and effects can range across all possible bail hearings, as well as by specific judge, and it makes for an effective visual storyteller. Take, for instance, the chart on your left, where the blue area shows the bail by income paid by Black defendants, while the pink shows the same for white defendants. If things were exactly equal, these areas should perfectly overlap, but they don't. The blue area is always higher, which is consistent with my findings, that Black defendants generally pay 2 to 11% more on generally by income, and this proved true when I considered other factors, such as the severity of crimes that people were charged with, their criminal history, as well as their age. Meanwhile, the second chart shows what happens when bail reform laws became stricter in July 2020 in response to public pressure to become tougher on crime. You'll notice that bail became higher for everybody, since the bars are higher, but it also exacerbated the racial discrepancy paid by Black defendants, increasing the bail gap by 70%. This leads to the conclusion that cash bail really isn't as unbiased as the law intends it to be, and that greater standardization is needed for true fairness. And even though bail reform became a hot ballot issue in last year's New York's governor's race, the vow to become tougher in crime, according to the winner, really shouldn't come at the expense of racial inequality in bail. Thank you.
Next, we have Mary Jane Johnson from International and World History, presenting Italian Slavery in the United States, American Immigration Policy, Labor Relations, and the Italian Padrone System, 1885 to 1895.
In 1890, the Chicago Daily Tribune published an article on the presence of slave labor in New York. Slavery had been abolished decades earlier, so what was this article talking about? Well, it was talking about the Italian Padrone System. The Italian Padrone System was a system of migration that developed in the United States in the late 1800s. During this time, short-term labor migration was very common, especially for Italian migrants. These people hoped to come to the United States where they could work for a short amount of time, save some money, and then return home to Italy. The Italian Padrone system emerged to help with this. The Padrone, who was a labor boss or a labor agent, he helped these migrants secure employment contracts in the United States for a short time. However, even though this system seems to make sense, to many Americans, the fact that these migrants were coming over under a contract meant it was unfree. Soon, comparisons between the Italian Padrone system and slavery emerged across society, as well as through the American government. My dissertation sought to look at the American government's reaction to the Italian Padrone system with a focus on these comparisons between the slave trade and the contract labor. To answer this question, I traveled to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., where I looked at a number of Department of Labor publications and labor bulletins, as well as congressional records, to see how officials in the late 1800s were talking about the Italian laborer. Ultimately, with these comparisons, I found that two concerns were isolated. First, the racialization of the Italian migrant, and second, the categorization of contract labor as free. These two concerns were important because at this time in the American labor market, free white labor was valued. The Italian migrant, he didn't fit into these categorizations. He rather was in between. When he was compared to Black Americans, he was white, but when he was compared to white Americans, he was not white. Over his freedom, he was unfree because he was under contract, but he did enter that contract freely. Moreover, the Italian migrant existed in this ambiguous, perpetual space of in-betweenness. He was in between white and non-white, and in between free and unfree. Ultimately, this research, it sheds light on a lesser-known story in American immigration histories, the story of the Italian contract migrant. But to tell this story, you also have to look at how the American federal government sought to redefine white free labor in the post-Civil War years. These two stories are interconnected. Thank you.
Letitia Murat from Global Thought presents the use of open source intelligence at the International Criminal Court.
Anyone here who uses social media platforms has probably come across footage from the current conflict raging in Ukraine. Social media platforms are being flooded with photos and videos depicting destroyed cities, flagrant human rights violations, and atrocious war crimes. When faced with this content, we often feel injustice, indignation, and an overwhelming feeling of helplessness. Social media is seen as a source of information, but not as a tool that can bring about change. But what if I told you that this content had the potential to bring those responsible for these crimes to justice? Social media content, also known as open source intelligence, is being used by NGOs to build their investigations and document human rights violations. In my research, I argue that this practice should be much more widespread, and crucially, that open source intelligence should be used by the International Criminal Court as evidence. This could bring about a much more democratic and transparent legal process, modernize the court, and increase its legitimacy. Yet, despite these benefits, the court is reluctant to adapt to this new type of evidence. Through my research and my own experience as an open source investigator, I have attempted to understand the root of this reluctance. I have studied academic debates, judgments, and spoken to practitioners. What I have found is that open source intelligence is unsettling the interpretive authority of the court. It is shifting power dynamics and removing some of the control that the court has over the evidence process. This is creating new actors such as technologists, human rights professionals, and increasingly civilians like you and I, and involving them in the evidence process like never before. This creates a tension between old methods and new methods. However, I argue that there are two ways the court can address this. Firstly, it should implement training for lawyers and judges to increase their understanding and competency in the use of digital evidence. Secondly, and most importantly, the court needs to change its attitude towards the shifts that are occurring. It should not see it as a relinquishment of power, but as an opportunity to become a pioneer in the field of open source investigations. The court has an opportunity to adapt and increase justice and accountability for crimes against humanity. Thank you.
Darcy Olmsted from Modern and Contemporary Art, Critical and Curatorial Studies presents Contemporary Artists' Publications in Digital Time.
Last January, I found myself on the outskirts of Oslo, Norway, hiking through a frozen forest in the middle of a Scandinavian snowstorm to research a library that would not exist for another 100 years. This freezing trek was in part due to poor planning, but it was also very necessary for me to understand artist Katie Patterson's future library. This is a work that is first and foremost an argument for slow mediation in the wake of digitization and climate catastrophe. In 2014, Patterson planted over 1,000 trees in the Nordmarka forest. These trees are to be left to grow until 2114, when they will be harvested and transformed into publications by various famous authors, such as Margaret Atwood. Until then, these authors' manuscripts are to be locked in a vault. as to whether the forest will survive until 2114 or whether books printed on physical paper will still be a viable medium is up to future generations. All those originally involved in the project will long be gone. Some may consider the future library a strange addition to a thesis on artist publications. It is a work that cannot be read, let alone held or even seen. It is a work that does not yet exist. However, I chose to discuss this work alongside two other publications by artists Neda Bamani and Stephanie Sajuko as a means of investigating a particular cultural moment in regards to both art and publishing. That is, a moment of hyperspeed. Philosopher Byung-Chul Han coined the term hyperculture to describe a moment in which globalization and cyberspace have caused cultures to speed past any previous known origin or comprehensible order. I believe the book is a concept provides grounding. It allows for artists to engage with a new landscape of mass information and speed. And it's also, and all of the issues that such a landscape encompasses. My thesis also serves to expand the definition of what an artist publication can be. These artists are turning books into code, into video, and entire forests. Their work also illustrates how the form of the book is being changed under the form of the internet and digital immediacy. Most importantly, these artists give an argument against the hypercultural condition. While sitting in the frozen forest that would become the future library, I realized that I was entering a world of deep time. I was entering the time scale of a Norwegian pine. I was forced to leave the narcissism of digital immediacy and instead to slow down, to sit in the cold and demand nothing more. Thank you.
Okay, and our final presenter this afternoon is Karlak Pang from East Asian Regional Studies, presenting the politics behind the curious case of Chiyu Ling versus Chen Xiaoqi.
What is the role that Chinese court judges play within China's legal system? Let's imagine we are in the year 2001. You are a Supreme People's Court judge by the name of Huang. A case comes before you involving two individuals, Qi Yuling and Chen Xiaoqi. Chen had stolen Qi's college entrance exam scores and used these scores to gain admission into college, to get employed at a bank, and even got married using Qi's name. For the very first time in China's legal history, you award Qi damages based on the Constitution. In China, the Constitution protects one's rights to an education and to their name. However, prior to your decision, no court had ever relied on the Constitution as a legal basis in their decisions. 7 years later, you wake up to your name bombarded all over Chinese media headlines. You were arrested on corruption charges, and your judgment for the case was withdrawn. My thesis asked the following research question. What does Huang's legacy tell us about a specific moment in China's legal history? I used the research method of analyzing primary sources, including Huang's published essays, as well as official communications from both the Supreme People's Court and the Chinese Communist Party. My research finds that the year 2001 was a specific high point in China's legal history where court judges were actually able to exercise independence of thought in delivering their decisions. More importantly, Huang's downfall demonstrates that there are heavy political costs associated with expressing opinions that are contrary to Chinese Communist Party official ideology. The significance of my project is this. In a time where people commonly accept that China's triumph over what Westerners call rule of law actually happened under Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2022, Huang's story shows us that as early as 2008, there were signs that China was backsliding from the rule of law already. For the general American audience in the room today, my significance of the project is that it challenges us to question our assumptions about China as a legal system, especially when we think about what judges actually act and play in a different non-Western contexts. It is important that we have to be cognizant of these Western-defined understandings and assumptions so as not to further orientalize China in our efforts to understand the East. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's give them all a round of applause. That was amazing. Great job. Great job. Okay, so judges, now it's time to finalize your scores. And now it's time to vote for audience choice as well. So for those of you here with us in Learner today, you can scan the QR code. It's up there. It's also on the back of your program. If you tried it before, it didn't work. Now it works. It's been activated. So use that QR code to cast your vote. For those viewing online, please click the link that's in the chat. Select one finalist that you would like to vote for and hit submit at the bottom of the page. Please note that you may only submit one vote and only one vote may be submitted per device. We will keep the audience choice voting open for the next 5 minutes. And we will now have a 15-minute or so intermission while we tally the judges' scores and collect the audience choice votes. After intermission, we'll call everyone back to announce the winners. For those of you who are watching us online, we encourage you to leave the Zoom webinar open so that you can hear once we've returned so you don't miss the announcement of the awardees. For those of you who are here with us in person today, we invite you to please help yourselves to refreshments in the back. There's food and drink, so please help yourselves until we're ready to announce the winners. Thank you. Hi, everyone. If I could get your attention. The votes are in. So, finalists, if you could meander back to your seats, and everyone else, you can either find a seat or just stand where you are. It was close. It was very close. First, I just want to say to the finalists, congratulations. You did a fantastic job, all of you. And after we're done announcing the awards, please don't go anywhere just yet because we want to get some photos. So just stay where you are, come up to the front, we're going to take pictures. And then as I announce you, if you're one of the winners, if you wouldn't mind standing up and come to the front so that everyone can applaud for you. Okay, so without further ado, and if you're watching online, hope you're back, hope you heard all this. We are now going to announce the winners of the 2023 GSAS Master SynThesis competition. Thank you again, judges, for making some really difficult choices. The votes were close. Okay, we're going to start with the Audience Choice Award. And the Audience Choice Award goes to Brooke Helmick from Human Rights Studies. Coming in third place from Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation Biology is Miles Davis. Congrats. Second place from Modern Art, Critical and Curatorial Studies, Darcy Olmsted. And finally, it is my pleasure to congratulate our first place winner of the 2023 GSAS Master SynThesis competition, Belen Ipola from Economics. Congratulations. Fireworks on the screen. Congratulations. So this concludes the 2023 GSAS Master SynThesis competition. Congratulations to the winners and congratulations to all of the finalists. Thank you, judges, and thank you to all of us for joining this afternoon. And please stay, help yourselves to more food and drink. Congratulations, everyone. Thanks.